Hi, everybody. I hope you were doing well today. The sun is shining right now, which is giving me so much energy that I desperately need after experiencing this winter. So I think spring is finally here and it's so exciting. So I want to quickly thank the Mildenhall Spouses Association and the Bake at Home Mom for collaborating on this event. I hope that you enjoy the baked goods that came with the kits. I know that I've heard like wonderful things about her food, so hopefully you enjoy that. And I know many of other people have been working behind the scenes to put this event together, so I just want to quickly thank you for that. So when we're working on our designs today, you have a few opportunities to do different techniques. So if you want more of this painterly or impasto technique where you have these really thick brush strokes, you can always do that by adding some thicker layers, especially on this top layer, to carve out your poppy designs. And it gives it more of the illusion of an oil painting versus an acrylic painting, since they're very different mediums. So we're going to find ways to work beyond just that basic acrylic texture that you would get out of your painting. And then the other design has it where we're doing that simple layering over each other using thin layers to create a really nice poppy design. So you can see here I have 3 different examples just to reference while we're painting today. And you have many different opportunities to personalize your painting and come up with your own design for it. So it's not just a simple step-by-step instruction. So if you want, you can create a different background color than I have here. I always like to provide a few examples of how those color interactions will work. So you can have more of a yellow tone if you want, or a yellow hue. You can do more of like a minty green color, or you can have a little bit more saturation with a light blue, or you can do something else. So you can base it on what your brain is telling you. And worst case scenario, while you're painting, if you don't love something, you can wait for it to dry and paint right over it. That's one of the really wonderful things about acrylics. So in your kit, you also have some acrylic paints. So we have some titanium white, primary blue, cadmium yellow, and cadmium red and cadmium yellow. So we're going to mix our primaries to create different darker green colors and lighter tints to our paint. So we're not actually using any black paint today that would normally be in this collection. And that's just to make sure that your paint colors stay nice and vibrant. And it also just teaches you a little bit more about color theory. So I know that several people in the group are getting more serious about painting and they have many questions about that. So I will talk about that in detail as we're working. You also have a collection of brushes that we'll be using today, and most of them will actually be using for these designs, which is kind of rare for my classes. So you get the full gamut of paint brushes. And you can use a pencil. This is optional if you want to sketch in some of these overall shapes of your poppies before you start painting. I know for some people that makes them feel a little bit more comfortable with that next step, especially after you spend so much time putting in your background. You'll also want some paper towels and just a cup of water. And just as a quick note, when you're painting, you never want your brushes to sit out too long with paint on them. As I said earlier, acrylic paints dry very quickly. So it's really wonderful when you're trying to work on layers, especially if it's a warm day like today, but you don't want them drying in your brushes. So when you are setting down your brush, or if you get distracted, or you get a phone call or the doorbell rings, just go ahead and quickly clean off your brush and then set it on your paper towel. And try your best not to keep your brushes sitting in your water because they will start to get damaged with time. Okay, so I will be introducing just a few little things in case you want to see some of these options if you want to get deeper into painting without having to invest in materials yet. So if you're trying to go for this impasto look where you have this really thick brush strokes where it has this 3-dimensional effect where they're popping off of the canvas, you can use what's known as modeling paste or impasto. That comes in a variety of things, and this one is tinted white. I'm going to show you how to use this if you wanted to for adding your poppies. But if you are really into more of that painterly look, you're really into texture, you can use this ahead of time to paint just on your white canvas. And you basically have to map out your design first so you would know where those poppies are and create a nice base of that texture there. So I'm just showing this. This is not necessary for today, but like I said, there are a few things that may be helpful if you really get into painting. Another thing that's helpful in the future if you're interested in painting with acrylics is a flow improver. So you can see here how our paints are quite thick. So typically we have to water them down a little bit to make them work easier on the canvas, especially when we're doing these thin lines. Oops, like thin lines right here. So I'm going to show you ways to do that without using a flow improver. And it's just, again, an option if you are really interested in expanding your painting collection. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move this out of the way and get ready to prep my canvas. So for this design, I'm going to be using the same canvas that came with the kit, just so we're all on the same page. The only difference that I have on here is that I added a little bit of masking tape around the edges, and this is just regular masking tape, nothing fancy. And I just went in slightly with my margin so I could create a nice white border around my design after it's done. But this isn't necessary. If you want, you can paint your background all the way around this edge of your canvas using your brush. And you usually want to do this when you have that paint already mixed. Obviously, that's easier to do then. But also your paint's going to dry a little bit darker. So if you go ahead and just use your brush to quickly fill that in, it will make your canvas look complete and create this illusion that this image is continuing beyond this little matrix right here. So I'll leave that option up to you. I mostly do this just when I'm photographing work, having a little bit of a white reference when I'm taking photos of designs, make sure that the colors stay pretty natural to the original. But that's me just being picky. So you definitely don't have to do that. And just with these designs, just to quickly bring these back here for a second, you can always choose to have more of a texture in the background if you want to create more of these vertical brush strokes. So you can add white, you can add other little pops of color throughout it that I'll show you in a little bit. Or sometimes people like to go a little bit darker with their background if they're wanting to create this really thick impasto look on top. So here you can see I added mostly like a deep red and then a little bit of green towards the bottom of my painting on this. To keep it simple today, I'm mostly going to stick to this design because this was part of the design for this event. So I don't want to go too far off course with it, but I will show you a few things if you want to take your painting further. So it's, you know, more of your style. So I'm just going to keep this right over here. Actually right here. So you can see that, okay? And what we're going to do is use our number 12 filbert. So this has a round edge to it. And if you have a larger brush at home, you're welcome to use that for your background if you're worried about, you know, taking the time to fill in all of this space. And for our background, we're just going to mix a light kind of minty green and yellow color. We're also going to add little pops of white and red in areas. So before we get started, we need to make sure that our brush is added with a little bit of water. So we always want some water on our brush to soften the bristles. And then you also want your water to be introduced to some of these paints, so they're going to flow easier on your canvas. So I'm going to take a little scoop of my white, a little bit of blue, and this blue is very pigmented, so just a little bit goes a long way. It's always easier to work from light to dark, so you'll see me being very stingy with the paints when I'm adding them together, and that's just to prevent me from using all of my white to correct a color. I'm gonna add a little bit of red and some yellow. So depending on how neutral you want this to look, you can always have kind of this minty or seafoam green color right here. That always looks really pretty since that's a complementary color to our red poppies. Or you can go a little bit more yellow. It's whatever your brain is telling you to do. So I'm just taking a little bit more blue as I go and making sure that I really mix it together before I add in more paint. And I'm going to add just a little bit more yellow to create a slight green tint to it. So that's a really pretty color right there. I'm just going to push that a little bit more. Add a tiny bit more red to it. And a tiny bit more blue. A little bit more green, or a little bit more yellow to create green. And that's actually a really pretty color. So I'm going to start with this, and I can always introduce more of my yellows and reds and whites into it. And you can see here, I'm just trying to extend that paint as far as I can without having like giant globs of paint. So that'll take a little bit longer to dry when you're working on your design. And I'm going to work in sections so we can create some of this texture from the original. So this is known as the wet and wet technique, where you're just working with colors that are already drying on the canvas. So they're not completely dry. If I want to introduce a little bit of yellow on my brush, I can do a few little brush strokes like this. And then if you need to, you can always push that color back with a little bit of that original color. So again, you can create some really beautiful vertical lines that are adding just a little hint of color that we'll use in other parts of our painting. Move that out of the way slightly. So again, just work in sections so you're not feeling like your paint is drying too quickly when you're trying to mix your colors on the canvas. If you want, you can always dip into just some solid white if you want to have just a little bit of a lighter area in spaces. So this actually looks a little bit lighter on the screen. I'll just turn that sideways a little bit. So it's just a really soft, muted blue. And you want to be generous with the amount of paint that you're adding to your brush, so it's easier for you to move it across the canvas. If you feel like you're creating, let's say, some textures like here, what you can do is either add a little bit more paint on your brush so you can move your brush easily over the canvas, or sometimes you just need a little bit more water added to your brush. So we're not trying to thin down our color too much, but that little bit of water will help if it's like clumping up in areas on your canvas. And you can add a little pop of yellow where you'd like. And then sometimes I'll add just a tiny, tiny bit of red on my brush if I want to include a little bit more of a muted pink that will have a color relationship with the rest of our poppies. So again, you want to do this while your paint is still damp on the canvas. Otherwise, you might start pulling up that original color. Oh, there's cat hair on here. I'm surprised he hasn't made his little introduction here yet. If you have pets on Zoom, you definitely know what I mean right now. Or kids. I'm sure kids can be like that too. So is that curiosity to what you're doing right now. So again, we're just going to continue back and forth until we feel like we have the right color consistency that we want for our painting. So I'm just going to quickly fill this in and then clean my brush. And again, if you're using the canvas without any sort of masking tape on it, you can always extend your brush with your paint all the way around the edges to quickly fill those in. Sometimes artists, oops, I just wiggled my camera. Sometimes artists will also introduce a different color at the end. I know when I was in school, sometimes I would want a pop of like a dark brown or a black around the edges of some of my canvases if it made sense with the design. So on this one, if you needed to, I would say to keep it kind of light. So you can always go around with either like a light white or an off-white for it if you want to just clean up the edges of your canvas. But it's not something that most people really pay attention to. It's just something that can make it feel more complete when you're working on your design. If you know that you're planning on framing it or anything, you can just have it framed without doing that extra step because it will overlap that edge of your canvas. So I'm keeping this one pretty light right now, but if you wanted to, based on these other examples, you can always have one that's more yellow tinted, or you can do a slightly deeper green. And by doing that, you would just either add a little bit more yellow here, or you would add a little bit more blue and yellow together in your mixture. And I'm just doing pops of red in this one too, because I always think that's really pretty. So I never like to do the same painting exactly the same if I can help it. And I like how that looks. If I want to, I can always use that sharp edge of my brush if I want to just add a little pop of white in a few areas. If you feel like it's kind of boring or you like a little bit more of that vertical texture, you can just introduce a little bit more white. And then if you need to tone that back or tone it down, you can just go back in with that original color mixture, and anywhere where you want to push that color back, you can. So that's looking pretty good. So after that, I'm just going to clean off my brush really well and make sure that it's not sitting in the cup of water. And then I'll just wait about 5 or so minutes for this to dry down before we work on that next step. So I will be back in just a few minutes. If you wanted to, let's say you're kind of in a hurry, or, sometimes I struggle with patience when I'm painting. I'll want to keep working on it over and over again. And then if you overwork it while it's still in this drying process, sometimes you can just pull up that bottom layer of your color, and then you'll have what looks like a big gap in your canvas. So to prevent that from happening, And to speed up the process, you can always use your hair dryer on a cold setting. And just for a few seconds, it will get rid of that moisture on your canvas and you'll paint right over those areas again. Okay, so I will be right back. Okay, so my canvas is now dry to the touch. You can usually tell if it feels like a little bit cool on your hands, if you need a little bit more time, or like I said, you can use your hair dryer on a cold setting to speed up this process. So I'm happy with the paint color right now. I'm gonna see how my poppies and other elements look with it. If I need to later on to add any other little streaks of color or more of this impasto look to it, I can do that. So I am ready for that next step. So with this one, I'm going to sketch this out on the canvas just to show you the process. And you can make them where they're patterned if you want. You can have more in areas where they look like they're kind of coming from one part of your canvas. So this one's quite simple that I did as a mock-up. So I'm probably going to add a few more than I have right here. And I have these other two designs out in case you need to look at the overall shape of the poppies. We're not going to focus too heavily on all of the details around it. We just want to make sure that we have the general spacing of them ready, and we can always paint over that. So with yours, you can use just a really light line with your pencil. I'm going to go a little bit heavier with it so you can see it on camera, but typically with graphite pencils, sometimes your paint wants to show through. So just keep a light hand with it when you're sketching it out. So let's see, I think I want to add one right about here. So I'm just doing that overall shape. So I'm going to start with this. It almost looks like a widened upside down triangle. Just keep it nice and loose because you can always paint over it later on. And then I'm just going to do these little petals coming off of that area. So with poppies, they're quite simple. They're mostly only about 4 petals for them. So you can always break them up if you need to. And they're paper thin. So I know many of you have probably seen them and photographed them with the poppy fields around here, especially towards the tail end of the year. So you probably have an idea of this in your head already. And you can always look at your own reference photos of things that you've seen if that gives you some inspiration. But I love the way that the poppies are here in England, especially with that symbolism of them with World War I. So even though they're quite delicate looking, they're very resilient plants, obviously. And even after such a the terrible warfare, especially on the Western Front, they were one of the first flowers to bloom in the combat areas. So it was a really nice way of showcasing like rebirth and renewal after such a terrible and tragic war. I think for a lot of people, it's a nice symbol of hope. So on this side over here, I'm going to do a poppy that looks like it's kind of open. So if you want, you can draw in that little center part if that helps you to start to sketch that in. So we're kind of seeing it partially from the side. Like that. And again, I'm just doing really rough sketches of this. So if you need to, you can always draw down that stem because when we add in some of our other little poppy pods and other seeds and things that are in there, you're going to want to know roughly where these lines are for each flower. And you can go larger if you want with your scale too. So you can have some where they're a little bit bigger than others. I know some of these poppies are massive with the heads of them where they're like that big. So don't be afraid to play with scale and just have fun with it. If you need to, again, you can draw in that little center. And I'm going to leave room in some of these areas just for foliage and other greenery that I want to have kind of framing around this piece. I have one that's a little bit taller. So I never like to do the exact same painting once, especially with flowers, because usually my brain will just want to experiment with how this design looks as I'm working on each piece. I'm going to see about drawing in some of these other elements of the poppy. So usually they tend to be very thin stems, and then the weight of the head of the flower tends to make them droop a little bit. So if you're ever trying to photograph them, especially on a windy day, it's kind of a nightmare because all the petals are moving around. But other elements of them, like the pods that are in motion or like in process of opening, have kind of this almond shape to them. So it's almost like a candy cane or a curved shape like this with a pod on the end. Okay, so you can always add ones that are partially open too, like you can see right here. So if I wanted to, I can have a few going over. You can draw it where it's kind of open right there, and then you can have the red right along that spot. So I'm not sure if I'm completely in love with that line right there. So if I need to, I can erase it later on. And then I'll add some of these where it almost looks like a crown on the top of this little pod shape here. So if I wanted to, I can always add in some of that. I'll just start with kind of this overall shape right here where it looks like an upside down, like elongated thimble or bell shape. So I'm gonna see, I might add a few along here too. So just take your time with this part. I'm kind of seeing like this diagonal pattern forming on mine. So I kind of like where that's going. I'm most likely going to make some edits to it as I work on my design, but you know, everybody's is going to look a little bit different. And that's the fun of these classes anyway. So I always like seeing variety of the final designs. So I feel like there's more creativity in that. It's always really cool to see what you come up with. Add another poppy along here. And then you can always have some kind of popping through the bottom half. So if you feel like things are getting too equally spaced out, because now I'm getting like this triangle shape, I can always have a poppy that's going off the page. See maybe part of the center right here. And that will give the illusion that it's not just planted right in the center part here. I try and avoid having anything right dead in the center because typically when a viewer looks at the art, their eye immediately goes to that point anyway. So if you have something that you focus on there intentionally, that's fine. But most likely if you are just adding in an element of your painting here, they're not going to move around the rest of your canvas. So if you can find a way to get their eyes to kind of go in, you know, different patterns, they're going to spend more time looking at the art and really absorbing themselves into it. And sometimes that doesn't happen. You know, everybody looks at art differently and you have different experiences with it. So, you know, it's the artist's like goal to get them to experience their art personally as a viewer, or to get you to experience it that way. And there are so many different methods to do that. But there's also ways that when you're creating your design, you can kind of kill that experience if you're not careful. So again, try and avoid that very, very center of your canvas if you can help it. Unless you're doing like a radial image where there's like things surrounding that. I'll just make more of these little pod shapes. If I want, I can have another one that kind of scoops down here. If I want to have another pod that looks like it's opening. And you don't have to do this all at once either. Sometimes when you're working on your design, as you're filling things in, you're going to find other spots that you really want to emphasize. I'm going to have something kind of coming in from the side right here. So these are kind of looping into each other as like this kind of loop. This one is bringing you down through about here. So yeah, there's some movement going on with it. I'm happy with that. Now down here, it might get a little bit sparse with the poppies. So maybe I'll just have a little bit of one kind of popping up. A little bit of pop of red here or there. I don't want it to get too crazy, but I don't want it to look like a big gap in this spot, which is why I think that this one looks a little bit odd in these areas right here, where that definitely could have been a spot for a poppy or some other element of the design. But that's just part of the learning experience too, kind of figuring out how you want your final piece to look. So I have a variety of pods. I have two that are open, one here and here. If I need to, I can add in the rest of that shape. And this one, yeah, I think that's going to be pretty good because I'm going to have other foliage and things happening around here. Over here might be a little bit sparse later on, but maybe not. Actually, I'll add one more thing. Yeah, I don't like that. It needs to be a little bit taller. Yeah, I like that. Okay. So there's a little bit of movement along here. These are kind of pulling your eye back down in here. These are going into this direction. And I think that'll be good. If not, then I'll paint over it. So no problem. So after you're happy with how your design looks, again, you can just keep a rough sketch. We're not focusing on these little top ends or like crowns on our pods right here because we're going to do that with our paintbrush. But I did try and give you a little bit more going on with this design in case you want to follow this shape. And I might have one where this one is a little bit open up here too. See a little bit of that color shining through. So I have one where it's sticking straight up on these, ones where they're seeing a little bit of the center of the poppy. If you wanted, you can always have one that's kind of drooping over, where it's like that, which would be pretty too. I don't think I have much room on mine for that. If I did, I probably would have put it somewhere over here, but I think there's enough going on in this spot. So I don't want to like overdo the composition. But again, you're welcome to add any other details that you'd like for it. So after that, what we're going to do is we're going to start just color blocking in these major shapes. So we're just going to start with our red first for our poppies, and then we'll let that dry down for a second, and then we'll add in our other detail colors. So we're going to start with kind of a red-orange color in the beginning. So we have a slightly lighter one that we can go over with our solid red. So there's a few things that you can use. A lot of people like to use this angled brush because you can get into some of these smaller areas with it, and it'll hold a lot of paint if you're wanting that three-dimensional or impasto look to it. Or if you are working on slightly smaller poppies, sometimes it helps to work with a smaller brush like this small flat. So whatever you're comfortable with your piece is fine. When we get into color blocking our pods, you might want to use like your small round. That way you can get into some of these little corners of your pods here. So we'll go ahead and get started. I think I'm going to use my angled brush for this one. So again, just like before, we want to make sure that we are dipping our brush in our water to soften the bristles and introduce just a little bit of water to our color. So I'm going to take a scoop of my red and some of my yellow. And our yellow is quite transparent. So if you have a darker background than what I have right here, you might want to introduce just a tiny bit of white to your color. Sorry, the cat is deciding to be part of this Zoom session from the window. Hopefully he doesn't jump into the scene like before. I just taught a class recently where he just like did a dive right into the paint, and that was not fun, but it was really cute at the same time. But yeah. Trying to chase your cat all over the house with acrylic paint on him is not the most pleasant experience. So on this one, if you want to get more of that thick impasto look you have here, you're going to really load up your brush with paint. And you can either work in either direction. So you can kind of pull your brush up to create some of that texture of the petals. And you can have them a little bit wispy in areas if you want to create more of that painterly look to it. So they don't have to have a hard edge to them. Or sometimes people will take their brush and just kind of wiggle along that top edge if you want to create more of that tissuey tissue paper look of the poppy. So it's not like that perfect shape. And again, this is just our first layer of it. So we're going to let this sit and dry after we do this. And if some of your graphite lines are showing through, that's fine. And since this is quite transparent still, I can still see that little center of the poppy underneath it. Again, here you can see I'm like wiggling my brush if I want to have that texture. Or you can just use your brush and just flick it out like that. Whatever feels best when you're painting. You can keep loading your brush up with that paint so you can have a nice consistency of that color. And this is where people sometimes will include this modeling paste or impasto paste. There's several different varieties of this, but you can mix a little bit of that with your color. This one has white to it, so it would definitely tint your color to more of like a pink color, so you would have to add more red. But if you want those really thick brush strokes, you would do it through each part of your petals to get that three-dimensional look. I'm only going to do that on the very end, and you can do the same thing by basically just really loading up your brush and adding it in just a few areas of your petals, and it will create a similar look to it. So don't feel like you are missing anything with this design. It's just to introduce a few things for students that are curious about materials. Because art supply stores can be really overwhelming, even when you know like a decent amount. I always feel like I'm learning every time I go on like a website when I'm trying to order supplies where I'm like, what is this thing? And some of them are amazing and definitely worth the money. And then other times I'm just like, well, you could probably not need that. So there are always just ways to be frugal while you're learning a craft. And then when you're ready, you can invest in materials that work best for your practice. So again, I'm really loading up this brush. I can still see the center of the poppy there too, so I'm not worried about covering over something that I might need. And then you can always introduce your graphite pencil back in if you feel like you need to draw in a few other references. And if you feel like you're getting too much texture on the edges of your poppies in a way that you don't like, just add a little bit more paint on your brush. And then when you go to press down a little bit harder, and that will help you have more of that edge that you're looking for with your petals. A little bit of texture is fine, but if it's distracting or if you don't feel like you have control over that, then I would say just to make sure you really load up your brush with paint. But everybody paints a little bit different. And again, don't feel like you need to copy this exactly. I want you to be able to use your creativity to come up with your own design and to just enjoy the painting process. So hopefully this is nice and relaxing for you. And then for these little pods here, I'm just going to add a little pop of red to them because I want that to dry down with the rest of my red paint. You can always have some that look like they're opening up a little bit more in spots, so they don't look exactly the same. That looks good. I feel like that's spaced out really well and there's a lot of movement within the piece. Again, if I don't like something after it dries down, I'll just paint right over it. Okay, so after that, I'm just going to clean off my brush really well. There we go. And then we're going to mix this green mixture here. So we're just looking for a mid-tone green, and then we'll add highlights and shadows in just a little bit. So again, this is probably going to be easier to use your small round brush. So this is the number 6. Again, you're going to dip it in your water. Hope you okay, buddy? Okay. And you're going to take a little scoop of your yellow and a little bit of your blue. And it creates a really nice green. Now this is quite synthetic looking, so if I want it to look more natural, what I'll do is I'm going to use a little bit of red into it. And not very much, it's just going to mute that color down a tiny bit. And the reason for that is that these are complementary colors. So they're on other sides of the color wheel if you were looking at a chart. And so when you place them side by side, they actually will make the colors look more vibrant, but when you mix them together, they will dull the colors out. So you can see right here, if I add too much red, it's going to turn into a brown shade. So if that happens to you, add a little bit more yellow and a little bit more blue. But that's how you get those brown colors. So you never feel like you have to order more paints. You can just mix them on your own. And this works for all of your complementary colors. So yellow and violet or purple are complementary colors, and then blue and orange. So the fact that we have a little bit of orange in here with some of our blue, and then obviously this has a green tint to it, you can have that next to your red. So everything has like this color interaction. So this is a nice kind of neutral green color. If I want to, I can always make this a little bit deeper by adding a tiny bit more blue, but I like that color. So with this one, I'm just going to add a little bit more water from my brush, just because this is a smaller brush and it wants to get kind of globbed up with that paint. So you'll see I'm spinning it in my paint to get rid of any big chunks of paint on the end. And then at the same time, that's going to load up your brush with that color. So it's going to be a little bit transparent, and that's fine because we're going to do several layers. It's just going to help you get into some of these smaller shapes. And of course, you can always turn your canvas if you need to. I know sometimes when you're reaching over, it's kind of a dangerous area to be in because you might just put your arm right into your red paint. So that's usually where I get a little bit of paint on me anyway when I'm working. So if it helps, you can just turn your canvas for this part, save yourself any trouble that might happen. I know that seems like common sense, but sometimes when you're focusing so heavily on something, you just kind of forget those things. Or maybe you're tired that day, you've had a long day and you're trying to paint to unwind. So you can relax, you can have a cup of coffee or tea, or if you want to, you can have some wine or whatever you want to drink to just enjoy the painting process. And again, this is just the bottom layer, so it's going to look a little bit streaky until we add in our shadows and highlights. And if your brush feels like it's getting a little bit too rough, just dip it in a little bit more of your water and mix it back in your paint. Sometimes it'll just start drying out on you while you're trying to get some of these thin lines in. I'm gonna add a little bit on these pods right here. So I'm going to turn this the correct way so you can see this a little bit better. And I have another pod right here, so I'm going to fill that in too. And these don't have to be that precise. You know, with painting, you can always be a little bit looser with it if you want to have more of the impression of a poppy, because we're not looking for photographic quality poppies here or anything. It's just about the process of painting. But each person paints a little bit different. So I'm I do a lot of technical drawing and painting. So for me, I sometimes have a hard time loosening up. Like if something is a little bit crooked, I go crazy from that. But with other painters, that's like an opportunity to experiment with more of that looser and just like more, what's the word I'm trying to say? Like you're having more of the expression of painting versus the technical side of it. And both do great. Like both can have very different feelings to them. So just embrace whatever you're doing naturally, and that will make you feel a little less tense with your painting. You never want to hold your brush so tight that you're like giving yourself a cramp. So, I mean, sometimes that happens, but I'd rather you just relax and enjoy the process. But like I said, I do a lot of technical work. So sometimes you'll see me like overwork an area or rework an area until I get it exactly the way I want. So after that, I'm just going to clean off my brush. Keep making sure you leave your brushes out of your paint cup. That will preserve them, especially with your pointed brushes here, because when they're sitting in their cup, they're actually sitting more like this. So after a while, they will permanently be in that shape. And it's very hard to paint with a brush that's, crooked. So, the nicer you keep your paint brushes, the longer they're going to last. And these aren't that expensive of brushes, but they're actually pretty nice for synthetic brushes that I got. Okay. So what I'm also going to do next with that same color is, this looks like I need a little bit more mixed up, but we're going to start putting in our stems. And so for this part, we're going to use this different brush. It has this kind of long, skinny bristles to it. This is the number 1, and this is called a rigger brush. So when you dip it in your water, it has a really nice fine point to it. And again, this is more of a specialty brush, so this isn't something I reach for all the time. But when you're trying to do these really long and skinny brush strokes here, it can be really challenging, even with your small round. And that's because you're running out of paint while you're pulling your brush across the canvas. So with this brush, since the bristles are elongated, you can hold more paint and water in them. So you can just drag your brush down. Kind of like when you're like flicking eyeliner, which I have definitely not mastered on any level, but I know other people that have, and it always has this really nice brush tip to it. So you can have a lot of control over where you're going with that movement. So I'm just going to quickly mix up the paint color again, and I might have this slightly deeper, since most likely we're not going to rework a lot of our lines right here. So I'm going to go for more of a really deep green. So I'm just going to use a slightly bigger brush to mix the paints, and then I'll switch to that small brush. So again, you need some of your yellow, some of your blue. We're going to add a little bit more blue than yellow this time. And you can see it's creating a really nice cool toned blue, but it has a lot of saturation to it. And since we're going to be muting a lot of our colors like we did with our background, sometimes when it's too saturated of a color, it tends to be a little bit jarring, where it doesn't look like it's part of the piece. So this is, again, where we're going to add a little bit more of that red to it. So it's going to darken that color and also just tone it down a little bit. If I need to, I can always add a little bit more yellow. And I'm just going to go in with a little bit more red. So just take your time adding your red so you don't turn it into a brown color. And if that happens, just add a little bit more yellow and blue. But we're almost there with this color. This is also why like the complementary colors work really well when you're mixing them on a plate versus out of a tube, because if you're looking for like these deep greens or even more those neutral colors like browns and grays and blacks, you can create a lot of those just with your primary colors. So it has this vibrancy and richness to it that you can't get out of a tube, even if you have like the best quality paints. There's just always something a little bit off with it. So I always recommend, if you're up for the challenge, to definitely see how far you can mix just these simple colors together. And depending on the range of them, like if you have an ultramarine blue versus a primary blue, it's going to create a different color when you mix it with your other primaries. But that's where, if you have your own collection, you can play around with it. You can create your own color charts, or if you need to, you can always just do like a quick swatch of your color to make sure it's the color you want before painting. But again, that's just a little bit more advanced stuff, but I just find that really important. So I'm going to add a little bit of water on my brush. And we are going to make this more fluid. So we're diluting our paint a tiny bit with our water. And that way it's going to move across your canvas much easier. So you don't want it to be like the consistency of watercolor. You want it somewhere in between where it's almost like the consistency of ink. Or if I think about it in like food terms, when I teach my watercolor classes, I talk about like consistency of like tea, milk, or cream. When you're trying to water down your paints, this would be more in between the milk and cream consistency for your paints. So you shouldn't have any globs of paint on the end of your brush. If you feel like you are getting that, just go ahead and push it off of the side of your plates. So yeah, this is a nice in between. So it's not going to be too transparent when I'm working with it. Okay. Oops, I'm getting a little bit on there. I will just make that part of the piece. So again, just always clean your brushes really well. And I'm going to go back in with this rigger brush. So if I need to, I can always add a little bit more water on my brush. And then I'm just going to spin this in that paint consistency. So it's going to load up your brush and it's going to make sure that you don't have any big globs of paint on the end. Now, sometimes what's going to happen is you're going to get this little tiny drop of water from your cup. So if you need to, go ahead and just use your paper towel to quickly just soak up any water that's on that handle, because eventually with gravity, it's going to pour down in and you're going to get like a little blob of color where you don't want it. And I'm just going to use the end of my brush to pull down. So you have a lot of control over this. And just keep loading that brush up by twirling it in your paint. So sometimes it's easier to go up, or sometimes it's easier to pull it towards you. So I'm just going to start by turning mine upside down because I feel like that's easier for me. But we're just filling in anywhere where we have stems right now. And it's a little bit darker than our pods, and that's exactly what we want for this part. So if you have a natural shake, which we all do, but sometimes you have more of a shake to your hand, especially when you're tired. So doing these like detailed lines can be a little bit challenging. But just remember that in nature, there are hardly ever any straight lines. So the more you have a little bit of a wiggle to your hand, the more organic that line is going to look. So don't feel like you have to really tighten up too much with your grip. Just try and stay comfortable with your paintbrush and just take your time. And where it connects to the rest of your poppy, you can just widen that line a little bit more if you want it to look like it's connecting more to the rest of the head of the poppy. Now on some poppies, it is just like a little tiny stem, like you're seeing right here connecting to this pod. So just to break up those shapes a little bit, I'm just widening this line right here for some of these, just on that top portion of it. So when I paint the rest of it down, it has more of a thin look to it, like that. And just continue rolling up or loading up your paintbrush with your paint so you don't run out of it when you're trying to draw some of these really long lines. It's going to feel a little bit awkward in your hands at first, but the longer you use it, the easier it's going to feel for that. It's just because these long bristles can feel like they're moving around on you a little bit too much at times. And this is looking good. Now, if you feel like your lines are a little bit thicker than you want, there's a few things that we'll do to thin them out. So you can see here, if you add in another element to your background, you can push some of those darker lines back. And you can even do that around the head of your poppies too. And that always looks really beautiful because you're seeing that original color still shining through a tiny bit. So it creates this nice impression of a poppy. And on this design here, you can see I didn't have much of that in this one, but you can always add little flicks of your paintbrush if you want to create the little prickles on the poppy, since a lot of them have that on the stems. And I just use the same brush for that. So I'm just using the very, very end of it to add in a few other little details like that. Oops, this one's not going anywhere. So just double check that all of your stems are actually connecting. Because it gets a little weird. And since I have some drops of that paint color in a few spots, I might actually include that for some of my design today, just to make that look intentional. I'll add some little flicks of white and other things, which you can do if you want to. Again, just keep loading up your brush. If you feel like it gets a little bit too thick on the paintbrush, go ahead and dip it in some of your water and roll it back in your paint. And that will get rid of any globs of paint that might be affecting the way that you're using the brush. And that's looking good. If I want to, I can just add a few more little flicks of color. And a little bit goes a long way with this because our brains are incredible. Even if you see just a few little lines to reference those little prickles, your brain's going to assume that all of these have them. So don't feel like you need to go down every single stem. You can just clean off your brush really well when you're finished. Did I get everything? I think so. Oh, no, I missed one. And you can always add in some extra lines since usually when they're in a field, you can have some kind of going off the side of the page or off the side of the canvas. So I'm just going to fill in a few little spots here and there just to make it less sparse. And then we will add in some other larger leaves and foliage for the rest of it. I'm just going to add some little hooked lines and things right there just to give it more of a feeling of poppies in the field. So having some curves here or there to fill in a few gaps always looks really good. But again, you don't have to go crazy with it or anything. You can decide how much you want to add for your painting, if you need to add any at all. Yeah, I like how that looks. And if you really wanted to create that illusion of it continuing beyond the borders of your canvas, you can always continue that line around the edge. So like right along here, I would just continue painting in that spot. It's not necessary, but some artists do it and it looks really beautiful, especially if you're seeing like that side edge of the canvas when you walk up to it. Again, we're just filling in a few of these little lines. A lot of this will get filled in later on. But we're going to be using a larger brush for that. So I just wanted to have a little bit more happening. That's looking really good. Now I'm just going to do a little bit of another layer on our pods with our green right here. And then we're going to go back into our poppies and add more of our highlights and shadows for it. So these should be getting pretty nice and dry now. So for this part, I'm going to go back to my number 6 round. And if you have a little bit of this darker color, you can start adding it to part of your pods. That should start filling in some of that color. And then what I'll do is I'll dip into a little bit of my yellow too. So I can have a range of colors where one side is a little bit lighter than the other. You can see right here, we're doing like that blending on the canvas, just like what we did with our background. and it gives you a lot of control about how those colors blend together. So you're not battling that material so much. You can see that right along here. And if I want to play that up a little bit more, I can add a tiny bit of white with my yellow. If I need a really big highlight. Now, if you feel like it's not doing anything except like blending too much, you can wait for it to dry and then you can go back in with that last really bright color. So I'm just going to have it, let's try and stay consistent with it. So I can have this really light color on one side, and then I'll translate that over to the other side with that darker green. So we're not really attempting to get like a full light source or anything into this painting. I would normally do that, but I'm working more from just my imagination here. So sometimes it can be a little bit more challenging to fake that light source. Oops. So I have a little spot right here that I don't like. So I'm going to clean off my brush, and then I can pull that color up with a little bit of water. So I can pull that color up with a little bit of water and then use my paper towel to lift that. So you can erase a little bit with your paints. It only really works if your background is completely dry. So just keep that in mind if you have to do that for anything. So again, I'm mixing some yellow and white to get that really light color. And then I'll go back into my darker green. Now, eventually we're going to have a really heavy shadow in parts of this, but we're going to mix that for the center of our poppies. So for right now, it's just getting this second layer on for our green. And then what you can do when you're trying to work on these little crowns, with the same brush, you can just tap down a little bit to create the top of these little pods. And since you already have these colors mixed on your paintbrush, it should look like it's part of that piece. If you need to, you can always go back in with a second color and just drop in a little bit of a deeper color like that. Or sometimes you can add the lighter color. It's whatever you think you need for that part. Nice and simple. These don't have to be perfect blends or anything. I actually like the way that this looks right here. So I just added quite a bit more yellow and white together on this one side, just to emphasize the shape of this pod here. And I'm leaving a lot of it unblended. So it's just a way of easily creating that range of colors of green without trying to be too like technical or perfect with it. You just want to make sure that you get that emphasis of light and shadow on there. So if it feels like a little bit rough in areas, let that sit and dry. And if it really bothers you, you can paint over that part. But I'm sure it's turning out really nice for you. I'm just gonna, ooh, I almost spilled my water. I'm just gonna turn this upside down so I have a little bit more control over these top parts. So I'm not reaching over my painting so heavily. Same thing, you can just tap on those little crowns. So again, just blend it together on the canvas. So you can go from dark to light or light to dark. And then after it dries, you can always do that again or add just a little pop of a highlight color and it'll look really nice. But blending with acrylics can be really challenging since it always wants to dry quickly. So if you needed to, if you're trying to add in really thin layers or anything, you can use a medium, either like a gel or a matte medium. Or sometimes you just need some flow improver to thin out your paint a little bit so you can get some of those lines that you're looking for. But we're just using water for this and this wet and wet technique. And we're kind of speed painting here. So usually when you're working on a project, especially if it's something that you're trying to sell or give to a person, you're going to probably spend a lot more time on it. But luckily, since this is a recording, you can always go back and add details to your painting whenever you have the time or feel like you need some time to step away from it before you continue on. I always think that's a good idea when you're kind of going through that process. You just need, even for like 5 minutes, to walk away, and then you can look at your painting again with fresh eyes. Add a little bit of a pop of yellow in a few of these. I think they need a little boost. And you can always reach out if you have questions while you're working. If you're using different paint colors than the art kit, you can always ask questions on that. And we can work together on getting the right mixes for your design. But I am happy to help. Might round this one out a little bit just so the pods don't look exactly the same. So again, I'm just bouncing back and forth between my yellow and a little bit of white and that deep green that we made for our stems. And if you're using a different paint color like ultramarine for your blues, when you created your green, it might have more of like a mossy color to it. So, just go whatever is mixing with your paints that you have. I'll turn this around. Oh, that looks so good. Okay, I just have one more down here. And then what I'll also do is where you have any of these thicker stems, we're just going to fill those in again with just a little bit of our other colors. So that mix of the colors we have for our pods, just so they don't look like they're unfinished. Most likely they need another coat of paint on it so they're not so transparent. And we'll still do this with our dark shadows that we're almost ready to create. Yeah, that looks good. Okay. After that, I'm just going to clean off my brush really well. If you need to give yourself a little bit of a break, you can let this completely dry and then we'll start on our poppies again. So I will be right back. Okay, so when you're ready, we can start adding in our other details of our poppies. So one of the things that we know for sure we need to add in are the little centers of the poppies right here. So you should still be able to see some of that line through there. If not, you can go ahead and draw that in. And actually on this one, just to give it a little bit more, I'm gonna add a little center on that one too. So I'm going to go in with my smaller brush. So I like using this small flat, but you can use your number 6 round too. And we're just going to mix up our deep blue-black color. So to do that, we're going to take a little scoop of our blue, some of our red. So it's going to create a really beautiful deep violet. You see that right here. I'm gonna add just a little bit of water to that because it's kind of thick. And I'll mix up a little bit more because I'm going to use that for other elements of my painting design. You can see I have a little bit of that added in some of the foliage around here. In person, it looks a little bit darker than it does on screen. And then I have some just in a few areas where I need that pop of color. But for right now, we're just going to focus on the center of our poppies. So just make sure you mix up enough if you need to add it in other parts of your painting. I'm going to get rid of any globs of paint on my brush so you can just kind of press that against the side of your paper plate or whatever you're using. And I'm just going to tap this color into where those centers are. And these don't have to be perfect. It's just making sure that you have a little bit of that shadow there. So if you wanted to, you can keep it nice and simple when we add in the rest of our details for our poppy. If you don't want to add any other foliage, you can leave it just like this. I'm going to take it a little bit further just because I think that I could fill out some of these areas a little bit more, but you can add a little flick of this color anywhere that you'd like on your design. So I'm just barely tapping this in on a few areas to create more of a shadow. But you don't need to add this if you don't want to. And if I need to, if there's areas where it just kind of looks like it's sitting too much on the surface, I'll just clean my brush off really well. Or I can use one of my other brushes that are clean. And with a tiny bit of water on my brush, I can just move that around a little bit. So it looks like it's connecting with the rest of that shadow. And this is known as glazing, where you're just thinning down that paint a little bit with some water and using it almost like a watercolor. So just very, very light transition of color. Now, if you didn't want to use water for that, you can use a matte or gel medium. Sometimes there are gloss mediums, depending on how you want your colors to look on the canvas. Just like if you use like Mod Podge and stuff, those all have different textures and final finishes on them. So if you like more of a satin finish or a gloss finish, your mediums work the same way. Again, we're not going that deep with it. We're just using our water as a way of creating the same effect. I'm going to add just a little bit on some of these stems right here too. And that looks really good. Now, if you're really up to the challenge, if you wanted to add a few little areas of that same color, you can go back into using your brush here, same that you used for your stems, and then you can just use a little bit of that watered down paint to add just a few little areas of shadows and highlights. I'm doing this kind of fast, but you can definitely slow down with that part so you have more control with your painting. And that will give you areas that have more of a shadow. Or if you just want to break up some of that same color, I always think that looks really nice. But just go slow with that part, anywhere you feel like you need that. And that will look really good. So after that, what we'll do is we're going to go back into using our small flat brush, and we're going to start adding in some details around these centers, because right now this red looks really flat. So we definitely want to change that up and make sure that that poppy is popping off the page, for lack of a better word. Okay, so I'm going to use more of my yellow, a little bit of red. We're going to start with slightly lighter areas, and then we'll add in that really big pop of red at the ends. So I'm just using my brush anywhere where I want that color, and I'm going based around the shape of the petal. Oh, you can't see that on screen. Let me make this a little bit darker, or I'm sorry, a little bit lighter. You can add a little bit of white to it if you need to, since these are quite transparent. And you're looking for kind of a nice light orange, almost like a pumpkin orange. Like that. There we go. We're just going to break up some of the shape. So we have a little bit more texture and color that's occurring. And you can see I'm just following the pattern of the petals. You can have areas where it's a little bit darker or a little bit lighter. And I might just play this up a little bit more on screen because Zoom tends to dull out some of those details. So don't worry if it's a little bit lighter in areas. We're going to go back in with that red in just a little bit. And a lot of the poppies around here do have more of an orange color to them. So I always feel like this creates a slightly more authentic looking poppy, but it also depends on what kind of poppy it is, because they come in so many different colors, and there's so many different species of them. So you can always find a good reference photo if you wanted to take this a step further and add in more details. And I'm just avoiding some of that darker area that we just put in. If some of it mixes together, that's fine. It's not going to really affect it. And you can just paint over it if it's really bothersome to you after it dries. And I'm putting this on quite thick because, again, we're trying to create that texture of it coming off of the canvas. But you can always think about like the little folds of the poppy. So you can use that short side or sharp side of your brush, and you can just break up some of those shapes. So you can have areas that are more red and then areas that are lighter. And that will give that illusion of like the texture of the poppy. Oops, got in my blue. And you can always do several layers of this, going back and forth between adding highlights and shadows using this orange and yellow color, or you can go back in with your red anytime you need to. Then sometimes I'll just go in with just that solid yellow if you really need to emphasize a certain spot of your poppy, because they always dry a little bit lighter, or I'm sorry, a little bit darker. So sometimes it takes a few layers of this to get it exactly the way that you want. I'm also going to add a little bit into where these little pods are, just avoiding that green area. Oops, got some right there. That's okay. And I'll just use that sharp side of my brush again if I just want to change up some of that texture. Here, this is already dried down a little bit. So that's where I'm just going in with my solid yellow to bring back some of that orange that we put down. So by the end of this, you'll have about 3 or 4, shades of your poppy. Again, just dipping back into that solid yellow. I just feel like that makes such a big difference. So I'm just going to let this sit and dry down for just a second and make sure that I don't need to add any other really light areas. If I need to, I can add a little bit of white to my yellow. Just a tiny bit to give it a slightly lighter look. And then I can go back in with a few highlights. So just to show you that, I'll just do that on this one here. But that might be a little bit too jarring when it dries down. So just add a few flicks of it to see how that looks. I'm definitely going to tone this down. But it seems like that orange just does not want to pop right now. And this is where oil paints are a little bit easier to use for projects like this because you can continue blending them as you go. And because they dry much slower, you can rework areas over and over again to get the texture and colors that you want. But we are going to get the closest we can to that using acrylics today. Okay, so I'm going to let that completely dry and I will be right back. Okay, so this is drying down a little bit, so I can go ahead and go back in with my red. Now, just to show you, if you were using that modeling paste with it, if you decide to go further, I'm just gonna take out a little bit of this. If I can open it. There we go. There we go. And a little bit goes a long way with this stuff. So if I wanted to incorporate that into my piece, I would just take a little bit of it with my red. And depending on how thick you want that to be, you can see how it's changing that color to be more of a pink color. So I can add some yellow to it too, to bring back some of that color. But it instantly makes it more of a heavy body paint. So usually with like student grade acrylics, they're more of a soft body paint. And then like the cheapest ones flow like right out of the bottle without any sort of like consistency to it. So this is a way of like transforming some of your other acrylics into that heavy body. And it's going to basically give you that opportunity to like sculpt out your poppy petals. Now, since you probably don't have this on hand, what you can do instead is you're going to just take a big glob, well, maybe not that crazy, a decent glob of paint on your brush, and then you can go ahead and go over those poppy areas where you want that pop of red. So you don't have to have that paste for it. You can easily do that with just a few layers of going back over it with your red. So I just wanted to show you this as an example in case you decide to include that in your final design. And we're just pushing back some of that lighter yellow that we put down. And if we need to, we can always mix up some more of our yellow and white to bring that color back. But this is where I'll just use slightly smaller brush strokes if I need to. And make that stand out a little bit more. So again, you want to really load up your brush with your red paint. And it's always about pushing and pulling where you want those highlights and shadows to go. Normally I would add quite a few more shadows in the center of our poppies here, which I might do in just a minute, just because there tends to be a little bit of a color change when you get towards the center of the flower. So I'm trying not to lose all of the work that I just did on there, but I definitely need to tone back some of that color. And then if I want, I can just, oops, I'm running out of yellow. I'll scoop out a little bit more in a second. You can always create that orange color again if you need to bring back that highlight. And then you can just put that in a few spots, wherever you feel like you want to bring that back. Again, these are just really loose and painterly, so we're not looking for too much detail, especially since the flower is easily recognizable. Oops, I got some green in that one. Oh well. So again, just take your time with it on this part. I'm just going to scoop out a little bit more yellow that I need, and then I'm going to show you how to do the final step of your painting. Because I think we definitely need a few more highlights in here too. Okay, so I'm going to take just a little bit more of my yellow and white. And create a slightly lighter orange. We can just add that in only just a few little areas if we need it. So you should have a nice, like, three-dimensional looking flower. And you can take all day just working out all these details to get them exactly how you like it for your design. So if you need to, I feel like this brush is too big. I just want to have a few little highlights. I'm going to move to this brush. This is the number 6 round. And then I can just add in a few little thin lines. That's better. Yeah, I felt like I was just putting that all over the place without really knowing exactly where I wanted that to go. And then I can just use the very end of the brush if I want to create more of that texture of the flower and the petals. And you can always push it back with a little bit of red. So some artists, when they do poppies too, they'll use like a palette knife and other things if you really want to make it look like it's coming off of the canvas. I don't often use palette knives, but there's a lot that you can do with that as a technique. And then if you need to, you can go back in with that solid red to push those colors. And that's looking pretty good. So I won't do too much more than that. You can obviously take all the time you want since this is a recording. And I'm just going to show you how to do a few more things for the foliage around here. Sometimes with the poppies, it helps to add a little bit more, since these are just like a solid blue-black, you can add a slightly lighter color. So I'm going to dip a little bit of my white into that deep blue and red that we mixed together. So it's going to create a nice like violet color, a muted violet. I'll bring this closer so you can see it on the screen. So I'm going to use that, and I'll just tap that with my number 6 brush in a few spots on the center of my poppies here. Now you can go in with a solid white too if you want. Sometimes it looks a little bit jarring against that other color, but you can always do like a third little color. I just add that just to show you what I mean. But having that like color in between helps it not look so jarring. Okay. And with the same brush, we're going to mix together more of our green. So you might already have some green still left on your palette that is not dried out. So I'm just mixing my yellow and blue together again. I'm going to mute that down with a little bit of red. If it gets too murky, like you added too much red, just add a little bit more yellow and blue into it, and that will balance that out. I'm going to roll my brush so I'm not getting any giant globs of paint on there. And then I'm just going to start adding in a few little areas where I want to have foliage. So you may need to add a little bit of water. This is not wanting to move very well on the canvas. So I'm adding a little bit more water to my brush to control that. You can kind of wiggle your hand a little bit too to create more natural looking lines. And we're going to break this up with another color too. So it's going to look a little streaky at first. And you can put this wherever you want on your canvas. I'm mostly going to focus on like this bottom portion. That way it looks like these are coming out from a field. I obviously had a lot in this one right here just to create some texture and different shapes in there. I have a few popping out from beyond some of your poppies towards the bottom. And then you can always have some kind of coming in off the side here. I'm just avoiding this little spot right here since I have a pod there. And that's looking pretty good. So it looks a little bit streaky in areas. So what we're going to do is add a little bit more yellow to our mix just in one spot. We're going to add a little bit of white to it too, just to make it more opaque. That way, if you need that other green, you can always dip back into it. So white with a little bit of yellow and our original mixture. And then you can just split some of these colors up. You can go into that original one a little bit, or you can go right beside it. And since that color is already still damp, it's going to mix together on the canvas a little bit for you. And then what you can also do is you can go back into that really deep blue-black color. If you need to, you would just mix together some of your red and blue together. So it should be like a deep, really deep violet. And this is where you can also add in some darker areas. So you're just breaking up some of those shapes. And if it gets a little bit messy down here, that's fine, because I'm going to show you a few ways to add your original background color back into spots. So here I'm just adding some of that blue into it. And since it's already damp from those other colors, it's going to mix together really well. And that gives you a color relationship between what's happening within our poppy designs, and we have that somewhere else in our painting. So if we were to go back in with just like black out of a tube for these darker colors, it's going to really mute down our reds and our greens, but it's also not going to have any relationship to that center poppy area. So if you're up for the challenge, I always tell people to try and avoid using some of those colors out of the tubes for one, but also see how far you can take one of your primary colors mixed at a really dark shade. And a lot of this is inspired by certain artists like Cezanne, or a lot of the Impressionists were not interested in using the color black at all in their artwork. So they would avoid it at all costs, but then they would mix their colors to get very close to it. And that's what creates that really nice vibrancy to their paintings. They also understood a lot of like how complementary colors work. And when you place them side by side, it creates a really beautiful color relationship. But we know so much about color now that, I mean, have taken centuries and so much scientific evidence to work through. It's just funny how with art, things can seem like they're easier to attain, but you always have to like respect the amount of work that other people put into learning these things. But I definitely like living in the age of Google for the most part, where everything can be kind of found with a very short amount of research. Okay, so I just, added some of that color to it. Now, one thing that sometimes happens, especially towards the bottom around here, things can kind of look a little off. So sometimes they start to really look like they're taking over the rest of your painting and becoming distracting. Now, some of the problem with mine too is that I have this tape that is making me not know exactly where that ending line is. So if I put a piece of paper or something over it, I can kind of see roughly where those lines end. But sometimes, let's say you overwork an area of your painting, you can go back in with this impasto technique, and you're looking at all of those negative spaces between your poppies and your other stems and foliage. So if I were to mix together that original color, I can just go right in between some of my positive shapes like you're seeing right here, and look where my background would normally be. So this is where you can use that thicker paint to go back in and carve out those negative spaces. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to do that in a few areas around here. Typically you would want this to be a little bit drier, but since I'm just doing a demonstration of this, I'm not worried about it. So you can always use your number 6 round, or I like to use my number, what number is this? It's that small flat brush. This is also a number 6. So I like this one because I can use like the edge of my brush right here, and I can carve into any areas that I feel like I lost my sky. So this is where I'm going to do a mix of both techniques here. Typically with these paint sessions, we would just do this positive method where you're adding and adding and adding. And with this other method, you're still adding paint, but it feels like you're subtracting things because you're getting all of these little negative spaces back in your design. So I'm going to take some of my white, some of my blue. We're going to try and get close to that original color. So I put too much blue on my brush, so now I'm going back in with a lot of white. And it doesn't have to be the exact color, but you definitely want it to be close so it doesn't look like it's jarring from the rest of your piece. And I know I added a little bit of red to it. So all of our primaries and mostly white. And I have to remember too that this color dries a little bit darker. So that's pretty close actually to that color that I mixed. And so this is a little bit damp, so it's going to pick up that other color. But if I were to carve into some of these green areas, I can get that back. It's also a way to clean up any areas. Let's say you have a stem that's one that you don't like, it looks a little bit thick in areas, you can just push that color back and thin that stem out. And I'll sometimes intentionally just put a little bit more of that color over parts of my design, just to make it push those colors back where they don't feel like they're all on the surface. So you get these broken lines like you're seeing around here, and it just creates more of that effortless looking appearance, even though nothing in painting is really effortless. You can always carve around part of your poppy if you feel like you lost some of that original shape. And that color will still shine through a little bit. So it creates this really elegant appearance. It also just makes you feel less, hopefully, intimidated by that painting process when you are working with some of these thin lines that are always a little bit challenging to paint in. So I'm going to really load up my brush so I can get a nice thick paint in some of these spots. And sometimes it will pick up a little bit of that color that I just put down. So it'll be slightly off, but it still looks like it's part of the piece. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a technique that I love using in painting. And in oil painting, it comes out a little bit easier for you. So with acrylic, we're always trying to tackle the consistency of the paint. Not saying that acrylics are bad. I like using acrylics too. But sometimes to get it to bend to your will, it can be a little bit challenging. So just be patient with it. I'm sure it's coming out beautiful. And you can always carve in between any areas that you don't like or you just want to push back. I can go around the edge of my poppy if I want to like wiggle my hand a little bit to make it look a little bit more carved out. So it feels like you're pulling things out, but you're still adding paint. It's just focusing on those negative shapes, which are always really important in any art that you do. You're always thinking about not only what's happening with this additive method, with these positive shapes, you have to look in between these areas. So they're just as important. And of course, you can pick and choose how much of this you want to do. So I'm probably going to stop right about here on mine because I really like how that looks. If you need to, after this is painted in, you can always go back in with some more of these really thin, spindly lines, which I think would look really beautiful for some of these areas that have a lot of negative spaces. So we're not trying to fill in our entire canvas. We're just thinking about how some of these are perceived. So for example, right along through here, I feel like I lost my poppy stem somewhere. So if I wanted to, I can use a lighter green color than I have here to make that stand out. So I actually have some of that right here that I'll show you. Demonstrations are always easier. So this is just some of my yellow, blue, and white. Ooh, that's a pretty teal, but it's not the color I want. I'm mixing with a brush that I probably shouldn't be mixing with. Just being kind of lazy. So you can always include some of that brighter teal color. I'm just going to dull that with a little bit of red, just so it looks like it's part of our design. And then I'm going to just add a little bit of water to make it more fluid. Spin your brush so you can get rid of any big globs. And this is where you can always add some overlapping areas so I can make sure that my stem is coming back. You can have more of these curved lines if you want. And there's so many different shades of green that you can create with your palette. So don't be afraid to take your time with this part and add what other elements you want for your design. You can always overlap parts of this other poppy in the background if you feel like it's not connected to anything. And if that's too minty green for you, you can always add a little bit more yellow in spots. And if you already did the live session of this, this is where you can add on top of things that you were already making for your design, because I know with the live sessions, there's always that time limitation. So don't be afraid to go back in and continue working on your painting. I always just have some areas where you have almost like this flicked grass. So I'm just thinking about the way some of these negative shapes towards the bottom are, because you would have to imagine that when you're closer to the ground, there's going to be a lot more going on there, especially in a poppy field. There's different stems that are coming not only from the poppies, but from other things that might be growing in the field. So you can always break those shapes up where there's a little bit more happening. And then just take your time with it. You can then decide how much more you need to add. So I feel like I definitely needed that. That looks so much better. And it's such a small change to do. You can also use that anywhere where you want to add that pop of that color, because I really like how that color looks. And don't be afraid to overlap things as you need to. It's going to make it feel like there's more dimension to your painting. And just have fun with, adding the brush strokes. Again, if it feels like it gets too off, you can always go back in with this light color that you had for your background. And then you can carve out those negative shapes again. And then the last thing you would do normally if you're completely finished with your design is you would just sign that bottom right corner of your painting. I'm just going to push this one poppy back a little bit so it looks a little odd right here. Okay, that looks better. And you can, again, always rework any areas that you want for your poppies if you need to add more red. I know on this one, I added several layers of red to create that texture. So it's the last thing I'll do, and then I'll show you how to sign your painting. I have a hard time stopping sometimes, and I'm enjoying this process right now. Sometimes I'm like so tired from painting that there's not much joy that comes out of it, especially when you have like really big deadlines. But today I'm in a good mood, the sun's out, so I'm just going to take my time with this part. And sometimes you really just need that solid red just to really make the rest of your poppy come together. I know I said that a few times, but after things dry down, they always look a little bit different. Yeah, that made a huge difference right here. Hi, buddy. Don't jump up here. Don't do it. Oh gosh, sorry, cat. So I'm going to stop right there for this part. Just kidding, I'm gonna put a little bit more right here. And then I'm gonna stop. Okay. And then once you're finished with your painting, you can just initial, typically in this bottom right corner. Mine is still a little bit damp right now, but if you're not comfortable with doing that with a paintbrush, you can use a paint pen or a marker. And a lot of artists also like to just sign the back of their canvas. So I'm just going to do this to show you where it's at. I'm just going to use this really deep blue and red, and I'll just do a quick little signature right here, which you can barely see. So normally I would do that in white, but I'm gonna let it be. And then the last thing I'll do is I'm just going to take off this tape. So I'm just gonna mute myself for a second so you can see this final design with that taped border. All right, so I hope you enjoyed the class. I would absolutely love to see how your design turned out. And again, please let me know if you have any questions while you're painting. I'm happy to talk to you through email or messenger. And then if you need to, I can hop on Zoom again so we can go over things in real time. But I hope you enjoyed the rest of your week. Thank you so much.